That, of course, brings us to tonight's Tuesday evening presentation. Misty Keasler herself is here as we prepare to open the exhibition of her most recent photographic series, which focuses on the industry of haunted houses with their grueling props and the cast of characters who inhabit them. Many of you will recall Misty's photographs of Japanese love hotels in the Modern's 2015 exhibition, Framing Desire, also curated by Andrea Carnes, and from which the museum acquired the 5 works that were in that exhibition. Misty is known for her immersive photographic projects, which have explored subjects such as orphanages, garbage dumps in developing countries, taxidermy, her own familial roots, as mentioned, the love hotels in Japan, and the subject of the Moderns exhibition, commercial haunted houses throughout the U.S. With each project, her camera becomes her ticket into unknown territory and affords her access to the stories she seeks, which she then in turn carefully frames and makes available to viewers, content that would otherwise be inaccessible, or obscured. She clearly uses the camera to reveal as it records. Her work has appeared in numerous publications such as Harper's Magazine, the New York Times, Dwell, the London Daily Telegraph, Texas Monthly, and it's in significant collections including the Dallas Museum of Art, MFA Houston, Museum of Contemporary Photography Chicago, Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and the Kyosato Museum of Photographic Arts, as well, of course, as the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. Tonight, we have the opportunity to see early work that defined Misty's career, learn about her dedication to the long-term projects, and gain insight into her attraction to the subject matter of haunt. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Misty Keasler.
Thank you, Terry, for that introduction. This is such an incredible honor, and I'm so thankful to all of you that came out on a Tuesday night to listen to me talk about photographs. I want to say a huge thank you to the museum, to Andrea Carnes, who curated this exhibit, and to Terry, and really the staff here is pretty amazing. So, there is a term in jazz called woodshedding, and it's really this idea that some artists need time spent alone in the woodshed in the back, honing their craft, and that needs to be time away from other people where you can just focus and work on your own craft. And then you can emerge later with something once you've kind of hit the milestone or the practice that you've put in has paid off and you're ready to go out into the world again with your work. And I really resonate with that idea. I'm a person who spends a lot of time kind of between ideas, working out what the next thing is, or once I kind of get my teeth in something, I have to spend a long time sort of obsessively focused on that between shows. And so this is the next thing that's kind of come out of my woodshedding period. But for me, they've been really critical to give me a lot of time for reflection. And so I picked 3 projects that I have worked on for long periods of time to discuss this evening. And let's jump right in. So I began a body of work about garbage dumps in 2003 in Guatemala. And really, I get pretty invested in long-term projects, and this by far has been the one that has taken the most amount of my attention. These photographs are really about the communities living around the dumps who sustain themselves from recycling materials in the refuse. And in Guatemala, I went down for 3 or 4 trips over a period of a couple of years really getting to know the community that was there. And when I was finished with this work, I assumed that that would be the end of it. I had no idea that I would end up spending another decade focusing on communities that live around garbage dumps. You know, early on in my study of art, I read this book by Norman Bryson. It's a series of essays on still life painting called Looking at the Overlooked, and it is a phenomenal book to read. And it changed my perception of domestic spaces and domestic scenes. So he presents this idea that the entire civilizations or new technologies were having their stories told through these old still life paintings. And so I got pretty captivated with that notion, and I began really looking at these overlooked elements of domestic living spaces, and thinking about ways in which they described the living situations or the economic status of the people who lived in those spaces, much more so than a portrait of a face would. So, additionally to slowing down and looking for those spaces, I also slowed down because the format of the camera that I'm shooting is a medium format camera. It is not the slowest camera that you can shoot, but for me, it is much slower than the 35 millimeter format camera. And the act of shooting film slows me down further because now film is so expensive that I always think about how much I'm spending if I go on a long trip and come home, and that makes me spend a little bit more time composing than when I'm shooting with my digital camera. But also, I spend a lot more time when I'm shooting on that tripod, composing my images and picking what I'm going to shoot. But I have this great interest in the spaces we live in, and I think this is a great example of how that space describes much more this community as opposed to just a portrait of this little boy's face. And I don't know if you can see it on the slide, but above his bed, he's written his name over and over again, which I think is a pretty common thing for children of a certain age to, make that marking of your name once you've got it down over and over again. This almost, I was here, or this is mine. So Bryson talks about still life as a branch of art that was suited to a vocation of humility, because it forces the painter and the viewer to look closely at objects that normally elude attention. So that's kind of my paraphrase of this, but here's a quote from him. "Since still life needs to be overlooked, it has to bring into view objects which perception normally screens out. The difficulty is that by bringing into consciousness and indivisibility things that perception normally overlooks, the visual field can become radically unfamiliar and estranged." So these objects are so common in their domesticity, and we overlook them so much that when we separate them and we ask people to do this look of just staring, they kind of become foreign and new. And there are some other elements at work in my photographs in places like the garbage dumps, because to an audience here, these are really different. But I'm pretty intrigued with that idea, and I think it carries through other elements and other bodies of my work, this idea of asking people to look at these overlooked elements. So the garbage work now comprises 3 bodies of work. It is a garbage dump in Guatemala, one in the Philippines, and then one in Nigeria. And I'm going to move through this quickly so that we have enough time to talk about the show at hand. But I was really interested in what makes each community really unique. This is an organic garden that's growing at the foot of the garbage dump, and there's a big presence of NGOs in the Philippines. And the structure of the dumps as I moved from dump to dump was pretty different. And then in Nigeria, it was one of those countries taking on the most it was one of 3 countries at the time that was taking on the most electronic waste from the US and Europe. So these monitors had all come from the United States, and they're repurposing them, which is, the highest form of recycling, because they don't even have to go through a process. But about half of everything ends up in the trash. And then there were some other issues. Trash was on fire at one of the dumps that I visited there. I actually visited 3 garbage dumps in Nigeria. And so I thought about the scope of the dump there and how some images might better fit it that move beyond the scope of a single frame. So that's what this diptych is a response to. The community working there is almost entirely men. It's seen as too dangerous for women. But there are all these elements of a full town inside the dump. I mean, there are cantinas and barbershops and phone charging stations and, real community. And so much of my interest in these communities is looking at that community. So I am hoping to travel to Cairo to see the Zabaleen. They are mostly Coptic Christians. They're a religious minority, and they do almost all of the trash pickup in Egypt. So that's the next thing that I'd really like to sink my teeth into. And then hopefully all of this will be a book and have, a life beyond that. Because once a book happens, I figure that I've said everything that I need to say about a body of work. So you may have seen photographs from the Love Hotel series in a show that The Modern had a couple of years ago. But I lived in Japan for a short stint as a teacher in the JET program. And My Lonely Planet, which was my guide there before smartphones, mentioned the existence of love hotels, these themed rooms that couples rent by the hour. And they were elaborate and wildly themed, and they seemed to cater to a fairly specific male fantasy, one that was straight, it incorporated pop culture, and it had an undertone of violence in it. So I was really drawn to the idea of making this series of photographs as a portrait of sex and romance within a culture. So looking at love hotels and sort of creating this portrait out of them. So I really shot all of these in an intentionally deadpan manner. I was never interested in having any people in this work, because I think that the longer you start to stare at these photographs and see that there are cuffs and chains and stocks, you start to kind of think about how would you use that element, and so as soon as you put a person in there, it kind of, changes the whole proposition of how the photograph works with a viewer looking. An interesting note, I'm pretty sure that's an Iraqi photograph that's on the right. And this is wallpaper in a room. So it's a detail of wallpaper. And in Japan, it is illegal to show it's illegal to show pubic hair. So that's why there's these odd sort of, Terry gave me this cool pointer. That's why there's this odd, tissue-looking stuff in some of the photos. One kind of surprising, interesting thing that happened when I was making these photographs is that I found out there are diaries in the rooms, so couples can fill them in, and they kind of became this element in the book of the human presence in these empty rooms. And so I just have a couple to read for the last photographs. Happy birthday. It's only been a month or so since we first met. I'm very happy to spend time with you on your birthday, although we haven't decided what we're going to do today, and a typhoon is approaching, so I'm not sure what we can do. However, let's have a fun birthday. So this is the subway, kind of brilliantly faked. I mean, I've always been interested in artifice, and And I love the idea of this blank cube room that becomes something that it's clearly not, totally created out of fantasy. But there is kind of a different context to a subway room that might happen in a love hotel here, if we had love hotels, as opposed to one in Japan, because in Japan, there is quite an issue with women being molested on public transit. And there are even pink cars that are reserved during rush hour times, and no men are supposed to be in those cars. So something like the subway room really takes on a different connotation. So another diary. Dear darling, thanks you so much for today. I'm sorry about the weather, but I'm happy I can be with you. We made love for the first time today. The bubble bath was also fun, wasn't it? Thank you for being with me, and from now on, too. P.S. I like you much more than Inuyasha. So, moving on to Haunt. I've really been pretty fascinated with immersive environments. I never really thought of haunted houses as immersive environments. These were not a part of my childhood. But I married someone who grew up going to them, probably way too young. And he started dragging me to one every year after we started dating. And actually, he is the most fun to go to a haunted house with because he screams the loudest. He gets the most worked up. Even if I were 8 months pregnant, he would use me as a human shield. I mean, really, the most fun person in the world to go through a haunted house with. So most of the time, I was not very excited to go to these haunted houses, although it was a blast to go through with him. And so we would pick one every year. We had some friends who would go with us, and one year we went to Thrillvania. So this is Thrillvania in Terrell, Texas. It's not very far. And Thrillvania was unlike anything that I've ever seen. So to backtrack about immersive environments, the track I started going on, I saw several years ago this project that Ballroom Marfa had commissioned called Hello Meth Lab in the Sun. And it was the artists Jonah Freeman and Justin Lowe, and it was amazing. You had to sign a release to go through for good reason. I remember stepping on glass a couple of points during the walk, walking through the exhibition, and you were around all kinds of burned out materials as though you were in a meth lab that had exploded, and you walked through a refrigerator at one point to get to another room. And I was just taken with that. And then, on a different note, there's a show in New York called Sleep No More, an immersive theater experience. And it also kind of throws you into this world in this fashion that's almost Alice in Wonderland, like you're trying to figure out exactly what's going on, and you touch things in the environment, and it's just incredibly immersive, appealing to many different senses. So when I went into Thrillvania, this is the facade of it, and actually this was built by Disney Imagineers. A long time ago, Disney thought they might want to get into really scary haunted houses, and it did not last long. But once you walked in, this place really blew me away. It was incredibly detailed. Every corner of the room was rich in all sorts of components that fed the story of the place. So early on in the series, I really photographed things that were basically the culmination of the room. So this room, the whole focus of the room, even though there was a lot on the sides and behind you, was this banquet. But I figured out, and this is actually about a mile or two from here. This is the cutting edge in Fort Worth. I started to figure out that what was most interesting on the film that I was getting was actually what was happening outside of the spectacle, the biggest spectacle in the room. So I was making extremely long time exposures on film. So this is, again, the Hasselblad sitting on a tripod, and most of these exposures are about 30 minutes long. So there's a thing that happens with film called reciprocity failure, and basically the longer, film should really be shot at pretty quick speeds. So once you get down to shooting something for a second long or 30 seconds or longer, you have a lot of problems. The way that color's recorded is not actual reality. And so I was getting film back that looked to me nothing like the spaces that I was in. And actually, I've never done anything like this. But here's a shot of a piece of film exactly as it came back to me from the scan. So I did more, there's more retouch on these images than I've ever done in any previous work, and a lot more manipulation. I mean, there's a lot more interpretation happening in the images that are in the show here than I am used to. And I worked with Laura Steele, who's an incredible photographer. She's actually Stephen Shore's assistant and does a lot of post-production or color work, for him. And so we worked on this together, but I wanted to walk you guys through this image so you can kind of see what I started with and how we got to what's on the wall upstairs. So this is sort of a global overall adjustment. The skin, this one's all about the skin, the details brought forward in it. The deer, that's the change from the deer there. And then this is a separation between the foreground and the background to allow the objects in the foreground to really pop. So this is just a skeleton, see? The skeleton is just further separation and depth there. And then the back corner comes back down. And this one is just color, saturation, and density of the background. So you can see we start to go away from that really garish color to something that looks a little more gritty and worn. Depth is added to the skull here. Some of the reds came down. See that there? And then this is the final image. So this is actually a room inspired by the real American serial killer Ed Gein. He was a serial killer and a body snatcher in Wisconsin, and this haunted house is actually in Wisconsin also. He tried to recreate his dead mother by sewing masks and clothing from human skin. So if that sounds familiar, it's because he was the inspiration for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and also for Norman Bates of Psycho, Hitchcock's Psycho. So, this room they kind of referred to as the Gein room, and that's the title of the photograph. And, a lot of times when I was looking at this kind of work inside the haunted houses, I went back and was looking at horror in paintings and thought of Goya. And so I spent a lot of time looking at Goya's work, which is funny because the last haunted house I was in, I'll show you guys, but they had Goya up inside the haunted house. This, for me, was a really pivotal image for the work. It was such an odd setup, and it was easy to see that there's a story, but it's difficult to read the story. The framing doesn't focus on the scare in the space, but I feel like there's something really uneasy about this image. It's like something isn't quite right. Why are all those papers near the tires of the car? So this was pivotal to me because I started to say, okay, these are the moments that I want to look for when I'm going through the haunt. The momenti mora, I'm totally butchering that, has been around forever, that reminder of death. And I feel like there were all these small moments, like little still lifes of that happening in the haunts. So the haunted house that's on this level, these very high-end haunted houses, they're designed to address almost all of your senses when you're walking through. They are truly immersive. They use soundtracks that are carefully orchestrated. A lot of times they're extremely dark. There's a tension of the startle that you know is right around the corner. There are smells, and there's visuals. So photography can only portray one of them, right? I mean, this is really at the point where photography begins to fail as a medium. This does not translate the experience at all of walking through a haunted house. And so I loved that implied narrative kind of makes your brain work in a different way than it does when all of your fear instincts are up in the haunted house and you're reacting to things on a very primal level. I knew that would be lost in a photograph. There's no way that I could get an audience to look at images and be so tense that if someone touched them, they go, ah! So instead, I liked this notion that a photograph could imply something really dark and something really off. And I think the scares that are coming from the images here are actually based on the same fears that we have when we're walking through the haunted house. It's just that your brain processes them in a pretty different way. So a lot of times I was working from the memory of the spaces that I was in. Just like on that Geen photograph that you saw, when I saw that film, it was so jolting because it looked nothing like what I remembered that space felt like. And so this work, not so much in the previous work that I had worked on, but for this body of work, I was really interested in portraying a feeling in photographs. So some of these rooms would be pretty scary, and I would get back the film, and it might be, it might just not work for some reason or another. And so I took some liberties with removing components of the photographs. So this is actually how this image started. And, the text wasn't so worrisome when I was in the space. It wasn't super distracting. But on the film, it's the first thing that your eye's drawn to. And, if you look at this super corny text that's on the cabinet, how do you like those rulers now? I mean, it's gross, it's kind of corny, and the image became much more effective with just those things removed. And I think this got at what made this space creepy as opposed to, dealing with exactly what was recorded on film. I love the darkness of this one and that red like spilling in from the other room. This is an example of something I feel like I'm drawn to, these sort of quiet domestic spaces. But if you look to the right side, there's this bed, and there's something that looks like maybe it's reflective or shiny, and there's a bed that's there's a body on the bed, and it's gory and, all kinds of gross around the pillow and everything else. So this is I wanted this in the slideshow just to talk specifically about how here's an example of moving the camera away from the spectacle of the room, the scariest, goriest part. And to me, even if you don't notice the pillow and how, there's blood spatter or something weird or gross about it, there's something about this image that's just a little bit unsettling. It's not quite a really peaceful image. Okay, so there are portraits that are upstairs and portraits in the book. And I thought it'd be interesting to show how I really changed direction on shooting the portraits. And in the beginning, I had an idea that I wanted to reference this body of work by photographer Timothy Greenfield Sanders. And he did a book on porn stars, and on each spread of the book, there's one shot of a porn actor with all their clothes on in a pose, and then the opposite page is the exact same pose, but they're totally naked. And it's very interesting and effective, and I think revealing about how we react to nudity. And so I thought, well, it would be so interesting to show these actors going into the haunt in their street clothes, and then look at them right as they're about to go in and act. And it just didn't work at all. I think it's interesting for a millisecond, but it's really about how great the makeup and costumes are more than anything else. So I didn't like them at all in relationship to rooms and those photographs. So I scrapped this idea and I started trying to think about I was kind of lost on the actors. And it struck me that I just needed to treat them with the exact same seriousness that I was treating the spaces. And I went to this. So I started thinking about, all of these are lit. And I would basically take a whole studio with me wherever I went and get it all set up with a seamless paper backdrop. And I was thinking a lot about early portraiture, like the very first portraiture that you can think of when you think about the very beginning of photography. And so that was helpful too, because I asked actors to really, I asked them to think about those stiff poses where people just looked extremely uncomfortable and try to hold a pose for, maybe too long, because I wanted them to be dramatic and confrontational, but not cheesy. And sometimes the details worked out to be more compelling when they weren't confronting the camera or staring it down. I think this is an example of that. So even if you ask someone to be constrained, not every character can be, especially when you have something in your mouth that's holding it open. Really, there's this level of just sheer ingenuity with the costumes and makeup, and I was often astonished. This is from Netherworld in Atlanta, and they are inspired by H.G. Lovecraft. And so there are two photographs, the Corby and the Banshee, that are both in the show here. And I thought in particular about how similar they were to fashion pieces, and I was thinking about that when I was photographing both of them. So there's one haunt in the group that's kind of an outlier from everyone else. It's called Haunted Overload. And it's out in the woods, and the owner uses chainsaw, and he's just amazing. He builds these giant structures out of seemingly nothing. The haunt's almost completely outside, and the immersion there is, the person who first told me about this place said, walking through it is like walking through Tim Burton's head. And this is actually from there also. They threw up this house in one summer, and it's the only sort of inside. They have a circus tent also, but this is you walk through this, but most of it is outside, and it kind of all towers over you. There's really a cultural specificity to haunted houses. In Japan, all the actors are dressed as ghosts, but that wouldn't read here, I think. If someone jumps out at you going, ooh, in a sheet, you'll laugh them out of the room, right? But we're really scared of monsters. And we're also kind of obsessed with monsters here. I think, you think about how popular shows like The Jinx are, the documentary about Robert Durst, and we think about all of our serial killers and how much we think of them. So the haunted houses are really based on characters from, or monsters from fantasy, and then real life monsters. So this is Netherworld, and again, it's inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. I was not familiar with him, so don't feel bad if you don't know who that is. He was an American author. He achieved fame mostly after death, and he wrote influential horror fiction. So he had a huge influence on a lot of filmmakers and writers like William S. Burroughs, Stephen King, John Carpenter. He influenced anime and manga. And he has some really great quotes, like, "Searchers after horror haunt strange, far places." So Netherworld is 40,000 square feet, and it's actually located inside the Georgia Antique and Design Center. So it's like this giant building that they occupy most of, and they've built all these spaces that are tight and tiny and look like things other than what they are within that space. I'm just, for the last few minutes of my talk, I'm going to talk about some of these inspirations and histories, because I think they're really interesting to think about where the inspiration for these places come from. This image is taken in The haunted house is called Penhurst Asylum, but the building opened in 1908 as Eastern State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. It was open for almost 80 years before a high-profile court case closed it. In the 60s, there was a television expose. An investigative reporter went in and did a small series of video reporting in there, and it painted this picture of abuse and neglect that people weren't used to seeing. Adult inmates were bound by heads and feet to beds. Many were severely mentally or physically handicapped, but there were also a lot of people that were totally lucid, but withdrawn due to the environment of the place being so loud and scary and the lack of mental stimulation. So there's quite a history there, and not too surprisingly, I guess, it's a pretty controversial haunted house. There are people in the community that feel like it's pretty disrespectful for this to be a haunted house, given the history, but I think a lot of the controversy, too, comes from a portrayal of actors as frightening inmates. But as an artist, I think the controversy and the conversation around it is pretty interesting, and this was really unique relative to everything else, so I thought its inclusion in this work was pretty interesting. So this is in the Scarehouse. It's located in Pittsburgh, and it has a really interesting history. It was opened as a bank building in 1915, but it had all kinds of crazy amenities that you wouldn't think a bank would have, like a full swimming pool, a full gymnasium, a restaurant, kitchen, library, meeting room. But the owners were ready to abandon the building 10 or 15 years later, and so that opened the door for the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks to move in. So it's one of those secret societies that's heavy on community. They were originally known as the Jolly Corks, and there was a dry heritage in Pittsburgh, so it looks like maybe, the camaraderie that was happening there and the availability of libations may have also helped it. But that's the building that Scarehouse has their haunt in, and they had this haunt, they're always changing year to year, and this haunt actually is no longer around. Last year was its last year when I photographed it, but it really borrowed on that history of the secret members-only society where things are happening that may, have a much more nefarious meaning. And interestingly enough, the people who work here get pretty scared when they're in the space by themselves. And I got really scared when I was in here. It is one of the scariest places I've ever been. And then this is this haunt is borrowing on some scary ideas from London, the Great Plague of London, where 1/4 of the population died in 18 months. And they also use as inspiration Jack the Ripper. So Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer in the Whitechapel area of London in 1888. And you can see Whitechapel's up there. And I think one of the things that made Jack the Ripper so scary is not only this knowledge of anatomy, because they thought that he might be a doctor or a surgeon, but also they never actually identified who it was. And then this is, no one told me that this was based on John Wayne Gacy, this storyline, but I feel like once you know the story, it's kind of difficult not to make that association. So the storyline of this haunt is that they call this his house. So they never name him, so it's his house. And this is a clown who drives an ice cream truck. He abducts children. He lets them loose in this house that doesn't have electricity, and he plays this really dark game of hide and seek with them, the darkest game you can imagine. So John Wayne Gacy is an American serial killer and rapist who murdered at least 33 teenage boys inside his home, burying most of them in the crawl space. Gacy's nickname was the Killer Clown because he dressed as Pogo the Clown at children's birthday parties and charitable events. So these are from that haunt in his house. And actually, this is the Goya right here. And that's Saturn eating one of his children. That's the title of the painting it's referencing. And it's funny, when I was shooting this work, is about the time that there was that menacing tone of scary, creepy clowns, and everyone was scared of the clowns. And then this is the last inspiration that I was going to reference. This is, of course, Ed Gein that we talked about before, in that skin suit. So he inspired the Norman Bates character and also the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So I photographed 2 different motels, one at the aptly named Bates Motel. It's great, the owner's last name is Bates, so he has the Bates Motel. And then this is actually called the Lunar Motel at the Headless Horseman. So the storylines are, these are 2 totally separate motels, both inspired by Bates. And at the Lunar Motel here, a psychopath runs the motel, and he has video voyeurism in all the different rooms. And then, of course, this is back to the Bates Motel, that borrowing on, Norman Bates did taxidermy and Psycho, and actually, I think this is so great. Right here it says, reserved your name here. So I thank you guys so much for the time, and I guess we needed to leave a little bit of room for questions. Yes.
How did you get access and permission to do that? Did you have to pay for that, or did you?
There's no way I could have afforded to pay what these guys would have deserved for me to get the access that I needed. I mean, I wanted to get into Thrillvania so bad, and no one would return my calls. So I actually went to D Magazine, and I said to the art director there, and he pulled the editor of the magazine into the meeting, and I said, this place is so amazing, it has a really interesting history. I think you guys should assign me to go photograph it and run a big feature in October so I can get in. And we talked about how it would be photographed, and they were game, which was amazing. So that's really how I got access into Thrillvania. And then once I photographed Thrillvania, and that owner was very generous with allowing me to go back several times. So the same owner owns the haunted house here in Fort Worth called Cutting Edge. And so I asked him, once that was all done and it was a nice feature in the magazine, if I could photograph Cutting Edge, and he was game for that. And then I got in touch with the person who'd been the editor for the Love Hotels book for me, and he thought it might make for a viable book. And so once I had an editor saying, we'll do a book of this work, and I had under my belt something where people could see that I wasn't interested, I was never interested in this work and making photographs that kind of revealed the wizard behind the curtain in Oz, because I feel like that would have been, that's a one-liner. All you need if that's gonna be what you're gonna do with your work, is one image, right? So I thought it was much more challenging to go this route. And once they saw what I was doing, because they could see the images that I'd made in Thrillvania, people were open. But I asked a lot of them. Really, I feel so privileged that all of these places said yes. This was a lot for them to say yes to. Yes?
Did you ever have any nightmares after having spent so much time on some of these places?
Oh, I did. I got really scared in some of them. The Scarehouse scared me to death. I had nightmares, and then by the end, I got pretty desensitized. Yes?
You were talking about how there's different cultural aspects to the haunted houses as opposed to in different countries like Japan and then here in America. And I was wondering if you did any personal research as to the history of Halloween, because Halloween goes far back to the pagans in Samhain and things of that nature. And it's just interesting how haunted houses are specifically presented on Halloween, in October. And So yeah, the question is, did you do research on the origins of this culture and like why we're so fascinated?
No, I researched the history of haunted houses, but I kind of stopped there because I read this great article that like basically tried to trace it was great in its stretch because it was tried to trace the history of haunted houses back to like Greek tragedy plays. I mean, it was quite a stretch, but I kind of stopped once I figured out what the very first actual haunted house was, which opened 100 years before I started shooting this project, like 100 years to the year, which was pretty interesting. But yeah, I actually had my hands full with these environments because they were just so mind-boggling that was kind of where my interest in the research started and ended. Yes.
Before you showed us some of the digital process, you mentioned working up to longer exposure times, but I'm not sure that you described that part of the process. I think you even mentioned up to 30-minute exposures, which is surprising to me. Did that mean that you had to go back to these scenes multiple times at first and set up the shots? And could you describe some of that process in film?
Right. So if you're familiar with photography, there's no light meter that tells you to make an exposure that's several minutes long. But these spaces are so dark that your eyes have to really adjust if you walk in from the outside into these spaces. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, Thrillvania was really my proving ground. And if Todd James, the owner, hadn't been so permissive in allowing me to come back multiple times, I don't know that I ever would have gotten my footing on it. But basically, I had a notebook, and I wrote down, exposure number 1 on roll number 12, and then I would write what the scene was, and I would write exactly my exposure, my f-stop, and my time, and then I would look back and see what negatives were too thin, which were thicker, and then I just started to rely on my own perception of how dark a place was. Sometimes I would try to take a photo with my iPhoto, and if it registered all black, I knew like that had to be, if even the iPhone couldn't take an exposure in there, then I knew, I was in for like a really long exposure. I mean, 30 minutes was about the average that I wound up with in the end. I did exposures that were an hour long. So it really was a trial and error. And aside from the ones in Texas, I could not revisit any of them. I mean, all these places I was catching a flight to, and then I was taking an entire studio with me worth. And really, I don't know that I ever would have felt okay about asking someone, okay, all that I shot before, it's just too thin. I can't, can I come back again and have you work, have people working, while I'm in there, and so yeah, I did a lot of bracketing and a lot of guessing, and it worked, fortunately. Terry?
Over time, when you were doing this project, did you start developing an understanding, or kind of even maybe just becoming conscious of sort of the psychology of this industry? Because, I mean, not that that's a single thing, but what fascinates me is that little, for example, Goya painting, like that kind of level of detail in spaces, as you're describing them, that are dark. And people are hurrying through, and they're in a state of not, absolute awareness. So they're missing these things, but the person who's doing it, that's important. So I'm trying to make sense of it. It's more than just, I'm going to get a buck because I scare a person enough to get them. It's not just the scare factor. There seems to be more to it. Did you start developing an understanding by seeing the spaces and maybe even talking to the people about those kind of details?
Yeah, the storylines are really rich. And you would, I think even the storylines that I share here, like you would immediately understand the Bates Motel image, that's Bates Motel and where that comes from. But any of the other storylines that I talked about tonight, you would never know those running through. I didn't know when I first saw them. I kind of quizzed them. And, a real light bulb went off. There was a guy working at Thrillvania, and when I photographed characters there. He was never available because he was doing other things, but he really wanted to be photographed. So he asked if he could just come to my house sometime. And I said, sure. He was a really nice guy. He's worked there like 20 years. And so he came really late one night with another guy. And I was glad they were later than they said they would, because when they got to our house, our children were asleep. And when they came out, they came in plain clothes. When they came out of the bathroom, they were so scary that the dog was on the other side of the house and wouldn't get close to them, even though they were kneeling down, being very sweet. And so I was asking the guys about their characters, because they had created them and had quite an extensive storyline for how that character fits into the haunt, which, again, you would never know when someone goes, wah, and that's all you see of the character. And so one of the guys had on this like burlap sack type mask over his head with holes in it, and he had like red thread that had sewn pieces together. And I said, oh, I really like the touch of that red thread in there, that like tiny pop of color, because I'm thinking about the image. And he goes, thanks, they're from women's dresses. And I said, what? And he goes, well, my character, he murders women, and his trophy is that he takes threads off their dresses and he sews them into his hood as his trophy. And I said, oh, so you used red thread for that part of the story? He goes, no, I used women's dresses. So, yeah, people work on these year round. They go from having hundreds of people who are working in that short Halloween season to a skeletal crew that works on it year round. And I think, they get pretty immersed in all these elements of what's scary. And then they're coming up with totally unique storylines. Like for the Scarehouse to take that one element of the haunt they called the summoning. And, it's just so shocking to me because it was so rich in detail. And they told me about, there's a theater room, that theater room that I showed the slide of. It had wallpaper, it looked grimy. It looked like it had been existing as a theater for 100 years. They built all that from the ground up. Like they originally did a very precise wallpaper install, careful that all the seams matched and all that stuff. And then they go back with create this layer of grime, and they put sconces on and build a just the level of craftsmanship is much like I'd imagine movie sets, what goes into the movie sets.
So who do you think their audience really is then? Who do you think they perceive their audience to be?
That's a really good question. I think they know that people are running through scared, because it doesn't work for people to slow down. It actually messes up their business big time. I went to one where they had signs that said, this place is not a museum. Do not stop in line. Do not, and I said, that sign is for me, because I'd be the person stopping the line the whole time. But I think they also understand that the richer it is, the more that you buy into it. And I think, Margie in her book writes about how fear is really fun when you know that you're safe, which is why, a roller coaster is a blast when you have those crazy sensations, but a car crash is not, because you don't know if you're going to be okay at the end of the car crash. And I think the more detailed and rich, even if you miss a lot of stuff, being thrown into this environment and having someone chase you is way scarier than the haunts that my husband used to drag me to that were just like plywood, maze that you went through where someone would jump out every now and then. I don't know. And they actually all visit each other too. And there are organizations. Once you get to a certain level, these are the best in the country. There's nothing like them. And once you get to a certain level, these guys all know each other, and they have an organization where once they close, one of for people who are in this group, one of the haunts will be open that year, later in the year, for other haunters to come visit them. So all the haunts from the organization will all gather at one of their haunts, and they have to employ all the actors and crew and everything, and they all go through each other's haunt and check it out. Yes, Steve?
Do you think that the characters the fact that they have to be in the haunted house for a month and recreate this experience every night for all of us to just be scared, that they create this elaborate story and this elaborate set because it helps them interact with each other and form their story so they
and have motivation.
every night
Absolutely.
have the motivation to do it. And we go in there, and that's what gives them their motivation to scare us, and we're going in there for that.
Absolutely.
experience.
And if you
So there's two different interactions.
And if you think about even the creation of spaces and the creation of spaces, the creation of costumes, the creation of every element of it, without a story, it's really hard to have a through line. And so I think just if you're creating something, it's helpful to know, the story arc. I mean, Margie also talks about the 3 elements of a haunt that are startle, spectacle, and story. And those 3 things are what make a really successful haunt. Dornith.
So I have a question. I'm here with students and about your creative practice. And one of the students was asking about doubt and how you as you move from project to project and you're developing your ideas, how do you deal with doubt?
With
That too?
wine. No. Well, I feel, so I'm going to talk in generalities, but I'm really just talking about me. I feel like artists deal a lot with self-doubt. I mean, that's kind of a part of our breed. So again, if you're an artist and you're super confident in this room, I'm just talking about me. But I feel like I need a lot of feedback. But it's funny, it's like that woodshedding thing. I actually, at a certain point in a project, when I'm first starting out a project, it's actually really important that I get the right kind of feedback. And a lot of times I'll hold work really close to my chest, because if I'm working on something and I haven't quite gotten it yet, and I have someone say, that sucks, it's not working, it can actually like kill the whole thing. It's kind of like at a certain point, I go from lighting a match that's this really vulnerable little spark that's going, and it's really easy to blow out. And at a certain point, like, it'll be a bonfire, and someone blowing on it super hard will actually make it better, and I can strengthen myself from a harsh criticism, because I love a really good hard crit, but if it comes at the wrong time, it can kind of crush what I'm doing. I feel like there are a couple people that if I've been woodshedding some and I feel like I have something but it's not quite there are a couple people that I can show work to that kind of get me, and they can kind of see my work in a way that they can kind of get inside of it and help me figure out, what the thing is that's there. But it's also really important that I hold back a lot of times, and I feel like something just clicks at a certain point in the work. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you'll have someone in your life that can kind of see, like, that thing, it's right there. And you knew it. It just helps a lot to have that. But, it's funny, my husband and I were talking, and he said, don't show those failed portraits. Don't show them. And I said, I don't know. I think it's kind of awesome to show how something failed and then what came out of it, and because we all do that. Like, I feel like I have stuff that's on the cutting room floor, and that private time is so important to just keep trucking and working. And honestly, I'm so obsessive that I kind of, once I really focus on something, even if it's not working, I just keep going until something comes of it, or I hit a full-on dead end and I can't move further. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you guys for coming. This has been very kind of all of you.